For those of you who don't know me, I am Robert Solomon. I serve as the Vice President for the Office for Diversity, Equity, and Inclusive Engagement. And I'm really honored to welcome each of you to our Power Diversity Lecture Series. This kind of work cannot be done alone. We have so many important and incredible partners throughout all the work we do through the year, and we definitely want to recognize our Office for Student Affairs for the continuing support and the things that they do. And we have a special thank you to Hillel, who is a co-sponsor, and my great friend there, Jared Isaacson, who has helped us to make sure that we had kosher food options, and so that we're able to make sure that we are as inclusive as possible in all of the work that we do. The Office for Diversity, Equity, and Inclusive Engagement sponsors the Power Diversity Lecture Series each year, and our purpose of the series is really to inspire campus dialogue, community engagement, and civic education and learning about really the national narrative on diversity and inclusion matters. Tonight, we'll be listening to Ambassador Dennis Ross and dive deeply into understanding Middle East conflicts from a diplomat's perspective. And I think that's a unique lens that we might not always see. And so we're really excited about that. I don't know if I'll get into it, but he worked very hard to get here, including not being able to make a connection and getting in a car and driving from Detroit from the rest of his leg. We need to give him a round of applause for his commitment and resilience to get here. You can imagine what it was like when I heard from Cleary and she called me and was like, we have a little problem, but it all worked out. Ambassador Dennis Ross is the counselor and William Davidson Distinguished Fellow at the Washington Institute for Near East Policy. He also teaches at Georgetown University Center for Jewish Civilization. For more than 12 years, Ambassador Ross played a leading role in shaping U.S. involvement in the Middle East peace process, dealing directly with the parties as the U.S. point man on the peace process in both the George H.W. Bush and Bill Clinton administrations. He served 2.5 years as special assistant to President Obama and National Security Council Senior Director for the Central Region, spending the first 6 months of the administration as the special advisor on Iran to Secretary of State Hillary Rodham Clinton. Prior to his service as special Middle East coordinator under President Clinton, Ambassador Ross served as director of the State Department's policy planning staff in the first Bush administration. He played a prominent role in U.S. policy towards the former Soviet Union, the unification of Germany, and the integration into NATO, arms control negotiations, and the 1991 Gulf War coalition. During the Reagan administration, he served as director of Near East and South Asian Affairs on the National Security Council staff and deputy director on the Pentagon's Office of Net Assessment. So we're fortunate to have him in our presence. At the conclusion of his lecture, we will have an opportunity for questions and answers. We'll time it all out so that he will not miss a connection to get back to Washington, D.C. tonight. So please give him a warm CWRU welcome at this time.
Thank you. Everybody hears this? Yes, me? Okay. I like to walk and talk. So that's why I'm actually walking and talking. It's not just because I had a long car ride here, but I am glad I made it. First of all, I want to thank you for having me, but also thank you for your obvious strategic vision, because who knew on the day that I came that there would be an event where about 3,000 people connected with Hezbollah have had their pagers blow up on them. Not only in Beirut, but everywhere where there's a kind of Hezbollah connection, even in Iraq. There are 9 or 10 people dead, and there are about 3,000 at this point who have been wounded. The only people who have been wounded were the people who were connected to the Hezbollah pager network. So there were a lot of prominent Hezbollah people who had their pages blow up. The immediate question one might ask, Israel has not admitted that they did this, although it sort of strains the bounds of credulity to assume that someone else did. What will Hezbollah do in response? My guess is probably a barrage of missiles against the Israelis. There has been, since October 8th, the day after October 7th, Hezbollah has been firing rockets into Israel, and Israel has been responding. The Israelis are now saying, because they have 60,000 people who can't return to their homes, that they will act militarily. It's not clear to me exactly what that means or if a decision has been made. And I can get into all that, but actually what I want to do is explain the landscape of the Middle East to you first. I want to go through how to think about the different forces in the region on the one hand. After I do that, I want to talk about what the Biden administration has been trying to do, the logic of what they've been trying to do, even sort of the moral imperative of what they've been trying to do. And then I will kind of conclude with some observations of what might be done differently. Since the title says this is a diplomat's perspective, so I guess I should offer some of that perspective. Okay, so let me start by describing this region in terms of the different forces that exist in it. Let me start with Iran. Iran has created a network of proxies. Almost all of the proxies are Shia, with one exception. Hamas is not Shia. Hamas is a Sunni Islamist group. When I use the term Islamist, it is not Islam. Islamism is an ideology. It's an ideology of power of those who seek to use the religion for their political purposes. They seek to use the faith as a basis on which to control. So there are Islamists. There are Sunni Islamists. Hamas is a Sunni Islamist. Al-Qaeda was a Sunni Islamist. There are Shia Islamists. Hezbollah is that. Iran is that. The Islamic Republic of Iran is that. So Iran has created a network, and it's a network that it refers to as the axis of resistance. In Arabic, the term for resistance is muqawama. The Iranians, when they talk about resistance, who do they mean resistance to? Principally the United States, but then those who might be connected with the United States. They refer to the United States, by the way, the Iranians never refer to the United States as the United States. They refer to us as the arrogant power, because they see us trying to impose on them, and what they're seeking to do is impose themselves on the region, and they see us as the impediment. They see the Israelis as also the impediment to what they would like to be able to achieve within the region. Now, they have created, when I say a network, they have created a whole series of proxies. I could go through, just in Iraq alone, I could name about 10 or 11 different Shia militias within Iraq. They actually put themselves in something they call the coordination framework. This is all of the Shia militias that are acting in Iraq, and they have a lot of leverage. Many of these Shia militias were actually incorporated into the security services within Iraq. So they're in Iraq. That's why I made a reference back. Some of the people who had their pages blow up today were in Iraq. Most were in Lebanon. I saw on my way here that within the West Bank, Hamas-related figures were also being told, get rid of your pagers, get rid of your phones. So whatever was done to be able to somehow infiltrate them and in a way that would have them blow up, I'm not sure what it is, but obviously it had quite a geographic reach. Okay, so the Iranians have Shia militias in Iraq. They have some militias, actually, that come from as far away, Shia from Afghanistan, that are in Syria. They have the most important of all of their militias. And the most important of all of the proxies is Hezbollah. Why do I say that? By the way, one of the things you'll see with me is frequently I will pose questions. And you can always count on the fact that I can answer my own questions. When you ask questions, we'll see how well I do. But with my questions, I'm actually pretty good. All right, so Hezbollah is the most important of all of the Shia militias. They're the most important of all of the proxies. And the reason for that is that, first of all, they speak Arabic. They're Lebanese. They have been the ones who've trained all the other proxies all around the region. And when I say I train them, it's what I refer to when I say training them. I'm not simply referring to the fact that they train them in terms of how to use arms, how to organize militarily, how to create formations, how to create a command control. They have also trained them in terms of building indigenous military industries. So one of the proxies are the Houthis, who are in Yemen. This is a country that is completely impoverished. And the one thing the Houthis seem to know how to do is fight. The one thing they don't seem to know how to do is govern. But they do know how to fight. Here is a country that is completely impoverished, and yet they are building their own drones. They're building their own missiles. How do they learn to do that? Hezbollah came down and trained them to do that. So we have the Houthis, we have Hezbollah. Hezbollah is the most important one for another couple of reasons for Iran. This is the only place where the Iranians have exported the revolution successfully. Hezbollah basically controls Lebanon. There is a Lebanese government, but because Hezbollah doesn't approve who should be president, the office of the presidency has been vacant for a year and a half, more than a year and a half. The reality of Lebanon today is it is also largely a bankrupt country. One of the things that is typical of this axis of resistance, when all of its members call it the axis of resistance, I actually refer to it as the axis of misery. Because every single one of the places, every single one of the states is either a failed state, a failing state, or a paralyzed state. If you look at where there's dominance of Iran through its proxies, you have Iraq, which at this point I would say is a paralyzed state. You have Lebanon, which is definitely a failing state. About 40% of all the doctors and 40% of all the nurses have left, given the character of what goes on in Lebanon. Syria, also absolutely. It's been essentially at war since 2011. About 600,000 people have died. A whole generation of kids haven't gone to school. It's a disaster. Yemen, very much a failed state. So where there's been this kind of dominance, we've seen that these are all places that have no hope, no prospect, and in effect, nothing to look forward to. Iran itself, even though this is a country with a very long history, of a significant culture, a very proud identity, and by the way, the Islamic Republic, its leadership doesn't forsake its Persian in a sense, it's Persian culture, it's Persian background, it's Persian identity, but it imposes on top of that this notion of the Islamic Republic. I was saying the importance of Hezbollah to them, partly it's because it basically has trained all the other proxies, partly it's because it's the only place where they've successfully exported the revolution, partly it's because they represent a kind of deterrent against Israel going after Iran's nuclear infrastructure. I will get to the Iranian nuclear program in a minute. This is something the Iranians have built up over the course of the last 40 years. They have probably invested $500 billion in it over that time, meaning this is really important to them. And maybe I'll save it for the Q&A. Why is it so important to them? But for a variety of reasons, it clearly is important to them. And the last thing they want is the Israelis to be attacking that. The Israelis tend to view it through a lens of it being an existential threat. I would say I don't think the Iranians ever actually intended to get a nuclear weapon to drop on Israel, because if they did, they knew what the consequence would be for Iran in return. But what they have had in mind, Qasem Soleimani, who was the head of the Revolutionary Guard's Al-Quds force, who was killed by the Trump administration in 2020, he called for creating what he called a ring of fire around Israel. The idea was we don't have to drop a nuclear bomb or an atomic bomb on Israel. We can make it unlivable. We can make it so that people won't stay. We can raise the cost, the constant pressure, to the point where the Israelis will people will leave. Hassan Nasrallah, who was the leader of Hezbollah, gave a speech in January where he actually was describing the Zionist movement, at least one part of it. Theodor Herzl, who was from Vienna and who was a journalist and who was seen as one of the leaders of the Zionist movement, but not one of the leaders of the Zionist theory or philosophy, he sort of said at one point, it didn't really matter where the Jewish state would be. It could be in Uganda. And you had Hassan Nasrallah quote this and say, you see, they'll leave because they're not rooted in the land. Now, many other Zionist theorists would have argued exactly the opposite, but this is something that Nasrallah picked up. And the supreme leader in Iran, Ali Khamenei, by the way, the supreme leader is an interesting title to have. Often thought it wasn't a bad title to have, but the supreme leader in Iran has also emphasized the same thing, that Israel will disappear within 25 years. And he began looking at what was the protest movement in Israel over the judicial reform issue. And he said, you see, the country's falling apart. You'll see the pressure. You see, Israel will end sooner than 25 years. We're seeing the demise of Israel even now. So Iran has a network of proxies. It is building, it has a very active nuclear program, which at this point is producing enriched uranium to near weapons grade. Now, enriched uranium, fissile material, is the core of any nuclear bomb. It's not the sum total of a bomb. To weaponize, you have to be able to take what is this fissionable material and turn it into a bomb. But it's the hardest thing to be able to develop so that you could have a nuclear weapon. Right now, the Iranians are accumulating 60% enriched uranium, which is very close to weapons grade. By early next year, they could probably have 10 bombs worth of that. That doesn't make it a bomb, but it certainly puts them in a position where within a limited period of time, they could probably produce a bomb. So why do they want it? I was referring before to, not because they want to drop it in Israel. They want it primarily to put themselves in a position where if they have it, their view is who can threaten them. Under that umbrella, under that shield, they can do much more in the region. They can coerce and intimidate others, and what's the response? That tends to deter others from thinking about being able to do much. So this is Iran. Its focus is not on developing Iran for its people. That's pretty clear. They have been under sanctions for a long time because of their nuclear program. They do have a new president now. The new president seems to be more concerned about the economic consequences and what it means for the well-being of the Iranian public, or at least he seeks to try to reduce the level of alienation that the public feels. Iran is not a successful state, but you can't necessarily call it a failing state the way you can refer to what I would say the other members of this axis are. All right, so that gives you a sense of Iran, where Iran is. Its purpose is because it has a self-image. Some of this is connected to its history and its self-perception. It has a belief that it, in a sense, has the right to dominate the region. It tends to look down on the Arabs. It tends to have a sense of superiority, and it feels it's somehow entitled to dominate the region. And so there's in a sense, you could say this is their posture and a broader strategy. All right, so here's one important fixture as you think about the region. Iran with all of its different proxies. All right, there's a second element or area. Here, if you look at the Gulf states, and here I'm talking principally about Saudi Arabia and the United Arab Emirates, these are countries that, yes, they're oil rich, but in the case of the UAE, United Arab Emirates, starting, I would say, at least 20 years ago, they put a premium on education. They put a premium on tolerance. They looked to a future that was going to make the Emirates not dependent on oil as the source of their wealth. They looked to create an information-based society. They looked to create a tolerance-based society, not a democracy, right? Not a democracy. Again, more of a kind of dynastic rule. But every year, if you look at polls of 18 to 24-year-olds throughout the Arab world, going from Morocco all the way to the Gulf, you'll find that the vast majority who answer a poll of where would they like to live, they almost all say the UAE. Because A, you tend to do reasonably well there economically, you tend to be secure from that standpoint, there tends to be law and order. When these polls began being taken, it was before some of the changes we've seen in Saudi Arabia, which I'll touch on in a second. It looked to be highly tolerant, and religion was not religion didn't figure prominently. I should also note, so the UAE has 10 million people. I'll pose a question here before I go on. I said I always know the answer to my questions. I want to pose a question, see how you respond to this. How, out of the 10 million people, how many do you think are Emirati citizens? How much? Say it? 20%? Well, your answer is correct. 90% of the people in the whole UAE are expats. So a 10 million population, 1 million are citizens. Now, not surprising, given the per capita income, that 1%, that 1 million, they do pretty well. But the expats, especially from the rest of the Arab world, also see this as a highly desirable place to be. The UAE is focused on building a resilient economy, an alternative to an oil-based economy. The UAE is focused on being a leader in renewables, in alternative energy, in AI. They're investing hugely in this country because to build the kind of big data centers you need for AI, you need space. The one thing they don't have, they may have money, but they don't have space. So we actually have the leader of the UAE, Mohammed bin Zayed, is coming to the White House this coming Sunday, Monday, and the focus is going to be heavily on investments they're going to make in AI in this country. Although it'll also be on Gaza, and I want to come back to that a little later, because they do figure in what may be, if we can get to a day after, they will figure in what will happen once this war is over. The Emirates, in any case, they see themselves playing a large role when it comes to AI, renewables, and being a leader, in a sense, when it comes to climate change. There's an annual meeting every year to evaluate progress that's being made on the standards that were created by the Paris Climate Accord. They hosted a year ago, they hosted the annual meeting. They want to see themselves playing a major role there, and to a certain extent they are. What about the Saudis? The Saudis are also trying to build a resilient economy, also for sure not a democracy. And yet, since the advent of Mohammed bin Salman, who is now the crown prince, we've seen a huge change in Saudi Arabia. The idea that Saudi Arabia could continue the way it was before Salman became the crown prince, his father was the king and obviously authorized all this, he saw that the kingdom could not continue to be governed the way it was, and it could not continue to have an economy based exclusively on oil. And if it stayed that way, oil would eventually, a combination of either run out or would be replaced by alternative energies. And if that was the case, Saudi Arabia would basically be in deep trouble, and the monarchy would be in deep trouble. Now, he understood you could not modernize if you excluded half your population, meaning if half the population, women, were relegated to very limited kinds of possibilities, that there was no chance of being able to transform the kingdom. So the whole approach to women was changed with an idea, or at least with the thought, that their role had to become prominent in the economy itself. From the time that Salman came in and played this role starting effectively in 2016, you had women representing 12% of the private sector. Today, that number is close to 40%. And when the 12% was in primarily secretarial support jobs, now it's in everything. If you look at Aramco, if you go to Aramco, which is probably the most well-run company in Saudi Arabia, sort of world-class, if you go there and you get a briefing on everything that the Aramco is doing, the odds are very high that the person who's going to give you the briefing is a woman. If you go to Saudi Arabia now and you want to get an Uber, your driver, good bet, your driver is a woman. The kind of things you see in Saudi Arabia today would have been literally unthinkable before, but they're not now. Now, Mohammed bin Salman, he too wants to see the Saudis be a leader in AI. The difference, unlike UAE, they have space. They want to bring American companies in to be investing in building these big data centers in Saudi Arabia. He too wants to be a leader in alternative energy. So big ambitions as it relates to this. He has a vision called Vision 2030, which is designed to transform the kingdom fundamentally. For him to be able to do that, he wants calm. For him to be able to do that, he wants to be sure there's no threats from the outside. In the past year, they resumed diplomatic relations with Iran, I would say without a whole lot of trust, but it was another way to try to keep things diffused. But what's the big thing that he wants now? He wants a defense treaty with the United States. We have not done a defense treaty with the United States. That's what he wants. Why does he want a defense treaty with the United States? He wants a defense treaty with the United States because he believes if there is an American commitment, a formal American commitment to the defense of Saudi Arabia, Iran wouldn't think about threatening it. And if Saudi Arabia doesn't have to worry about its security, then it will be able to develop what it wants. And the real priority is the development and modernization of Saudi Arabia. So how does he get a defense treaty with the United States? He needs to normalize with Israel. Prior to October 7th, the U.S. and Saudi Arabia were extremely close to being able to produce a complete bilateral understanding between the U.S. and Saudi Arabia, and also close to what was needed for normalization. He said he needed a Palestinian dimension to this. He had to show that the result of doing normalization with Israel led to an approach on the Palestinian issue that showed Saudi Arabia having produced something that hadn't been produced before. Now, at that time, it wasn't more finely developed, but what he had in mind was he wanted to be able to show, look, unlike the Oslo process, which was launched on September 13th, 1993, but but it has not produced what was expected of it. He would end up with his move, he would end up producing something that really did yield an outcome for the Palestinians. Prior to October 7th, I think the administration and the Saudis and the Israelis thought they were very close to it. Since October 7th, given the character of the war and the suffering of Palestinians in Gaza, the mood in Saudi Arabia is different. It hasn't changed the interest of Mohammed Salman in having a defense treaty and getting and doing normalization, but it has probably raised what he requires for the Palestinians for him to be able to justify the step that he would be taking. All right, so these are what I'll call those in the Arab world who see themselves wanting to be in a position where they're part of the future. They have digitally based economies. They have information-based economies. They have economies that have been diversified to the point where they're no longer sort of simply based on oil. They see themselves being leaders, not just in the region, but beyond. What they want, therefore, is a kind of stability. Now, when I mentioned the UAE was probably the most important country in the Abraham Accords. How many people here have heard of the Abraham Accords? Okay. For those of you who haven't, the Abraham Accords were basically concluded between the UAE, Bahrain, Morocco, Sudan, I put in a slightly different category. So the UAE was probably the most important country that produced the Abraham Accords. The Abraham Accords produced bilateral peace treaties between the UAE and Israel, Bahrain and Israel, Morocco and Israel, and Sudan and Israel. Now, Sudan has collapsed into a catastrophic civil war with numbers of people dead that dwarfs even what we're seeing in Gaza. So it's not really, nothing is being pursued there. The Abraham Accord countries made a decision. Oftentimes when I'm asked, how have the Abraham Accord countries, how are they changing the region? And I said, it's a good question, but it's not the right question. The right question is, how did the region change so that the Abraham Accords became possible? Many people thought this was a function of common threats. And to be fair, that's how it started. I'll tell you a short story, a very short story. In the beginning of the Obama administration, as Robert said, I had responsibility for Iran-related policies in the State Department. And I was invited to go see the Emirati ambassador to the United States. And he called and said, look, I'd like to have a conversation about Iran. Can you come see me? I don't really want to come to the State Department. Let's do it informally. He had a suite at the Ritz-Carlton. He said, can you come see me in the Ritz-Carlton? I said, sure, I always like to get out of the State Department, so sure. I walk over there. He opens the door, and who's standing there with him? The Israeli ambassador to the United States. The meeting was the message. The message was, look, we see things the same way. We see the same threat. We hope that you will develop your policies to deal with the threat that we see coming from the Iranians. The convergence between the UAE and Israel and many of the other Arab states, at least privately in Israel, began on the basis of security. But it began to change over time. It's not that the security issue disappeared. And events like today, if the Israelis are the ones who are able to somehow create explosions in at least 3,000 pagers from large distances away, this isn't going to reduce the attraction of Israeli technology to these countries. But the focus initially was on security after what was known as the Arab Spring. In a lot of parts of the country, spring is really short. Turns out in the Arab world, it was really short as well. We don't really have too many success stories from the Arab Spring. But what the Arab Spring did, at least for these countries in the Gulf in particular, it alarmed them. It sent them a message If your publics become dissatisfied enough, they will go to the squares. They will rise up. If they are sufficiently unhappy because the basic governance is bad, the delivery of economic goods is poor, that frustration is going to spill over and it will have a political expression. And it will produce what you saw in the entire square in Cairo. So you began to see the Gulf states in particular begin to focus, how can we improve governance? Not democratizing, but how can we improve governance? How can we improve delivery of services? How can we make sure that the economy is working in a way that will sustain support of the public? And they began to see these challenges, and they said, some of what we face, we're facing, especially with climate change. One of the things that has not been understood here, what provoked the uprising in Syria was actually drought. 1 million people moved off of the farms to the cities, couldn't be employed. And drought, climate change became a bigger deal. So if you're going to have decent governance, if you're going to be able to deliver an economy, then you needed to have water security. You need to have food security, which is obviously related to it. As time went by, if you're going to be database societies, you needed to have cybersecurity. So in all these areas, Israel was cutting edge, especially in water. They lead the world in all sorts of water technologies, from drip irrigation to actually being able to pull humidity out of the atmosphere. There's a company called WaterGen, and it actually pulls humidity out of the atmosphere and turns it into drinking water. And each machine can provide actually a substantial amount of water. Israel also created drought-resistant crops. So you even now have an Israeli company that can produce wheat and rice, which are water-intensive crops, at a fraction of the amount of water that's needed. So the areas where these countries felt they had a need, and it was related to the need to show they could deliver for their publics, they saw the Israelis having something to offer. So what started as a kind of security military relationship evolved into something that had much more of an economic base to it. In the case of the UAE, they allowed the Israelis to establish a diplomatic presence in the International Renewable Water Agency. It's a UN agency, but it was based in Abu Dhabi, and they allowed the Israelis in 2015 to establish a presence. What I saw in 2009 was a convergence between the two of them in terms of their threat perceptions. By 2015, they were already allowing the Israelis to have a presence. That built up to allowing different delegations of Israelis, including sports and cultural delegations, to come to Abu Dhabi. By 2020, there was an expo in Doha, at least there was supposed to be, planned. The Israelis were allowed to have a pavilion there. Now, it turned out COVID intervened, so Expo 2020 became Expo 2021. This was all before the Abraham Accords. You had a decade of a relationship that was being built between them before the Abraham Accords. What ended up happening is that the UAE, at a certain point, became concerned. When the Trump administration put out the Trump plan, how many people here remember the Trump peace plan? Not many, but I'm telling you, there was a Trump peace plan. Well, the day that it was unveiled, it was January 28th, 2020, Prime Minister Netanyahu said that Israel would annex the parts of the Trump peace plan, annex the parts in the West Bank that were going to be given to Israel, that they would annex that territory. Now, here was the UAE, and the UAE's view was, we have this relationship with Israel which is developing. But if Israel goes ahead and annexes what it would amount to 30% of the West Bank, this is going to produce a backlash and explosion in the rest of the region. It's going to make it impossible for us to be able to have this kind of relationship, and we want this relationship. So first, the Emirati ambassador who I mentioned, before. His name is Yusuf El-Table. He writes an article in a leading Israeli paper in which he says Israel can have annexation or normalization, but it can't have both. Now, that didn't necessarily change the Israeli behavior. So what Oteba and his boss did is they basically went to Trump and said, look, we're ready to do a peace deal with Israel, but there can't be annexation. So the Trump administration said, okay, suspend annexation for 4 years, and the Emirates also made certain weapons requests. That was the basis on which the Abraham Accords emerged. So the Abraham Accords emerged, Bahrain follows suit, Morocco as well. I think close to 1 million Israelis have traveled to the UAE. You don't see a comparable visitation to Israel, but there has been serious business. All these countries, these three anyway, none of them have broken relations with the Gaza war. But the nature of their relationships are not advancing either, because they're affected by the climate. If you go to the Middle East and you, as I do frequently, and you watch any of the Arab satellite stations, you'll see the death and destruction within Gaza. And not surprisingly, it affects people. You see those images, they're terrible. So they're going to affect people. So that process has slowed. The Saudi desire, as I said, for normalization or at least a defense treaty, that hasn't disappeared, but the price of what they expect from the Israelis has gone up. All right, so what about Israel? How do we look at Israel? Since I've covered the Iranians, their network, the Gulf states, some of the other Arab states, and we can, in the Q&A, if you want me to get into the other Arab states, I'm happy to do that as well. But since we don't have until tomorrow, I'll limit myself. What about Israel? Right, so Israel and Prime Minister Netanyahu clearly has an interest in Saudi normalization. As I said, right before October 7th, there was, in fact, a very high anticipation that this deal was about to be struck. Is that the reason that Hamas struck on October 7th? It's one of the reasons, but this was clearly planned over a long period of time. I will come to Hamas after I do Israel. For Israel, today, it's still October 7th. I'm going to repeat that. For Israel, today, it is still October 7th. We're coming up on the one-year anniversary. It is still October 7th. Why do I say that? I say that because it was a complete shock. Israel was unprepared for it. It thought if there was going to be an onslaught, it was going to come from Lebanon with Hezbollah. Israel was prepared for that. It built forces up to resist that, to prevent that. But also because this particular Israeli government that came to power in December of 2022 is the most right-wing, ultra-Orthodox government that Israel's ever had. And they became much more active in terms of pressing settlement activity in the West Bank. Lo and behold, the level of violence from the West Bank against settlers and even attacks into Israel went up. So this government that was dominated by the right wing, therefore, insisted on building the military presence to stop the violence. Look, if you're living in the West Bank and you're a target almost every day, and they were almost every day, not a shock. So the military presence is built up in the West Bank, the military presence is built up in the north, but it's not built up in Gaza or opposite Gaza. Israel is out of Gaza. Israel withdrew from Gaza in September of 2005. It withdrew all the settlements, and it withdrew all of its soldiers. It even dismantled the cemeteries there. So you had these areas along the periphery. And the people, by the way, who made up the areas along the periphery, they were people from the Israeli left. All of these communities that were built along the border, the people who lived there, the group known as Peace Now, Shalom Akshav, I went into some of these communities afterwards. you still see that these were people who were the strongest advocates for peace in Israel. So on October 7th, 1,200 are killed, 300 at a music festival alone. Kids are killed in front of their parents. Parents are killed in front of their kids. There are rapes. The level of violence is kind of unlimited. And 250 people are kidnapped. Those who are kidnapped are as young as 9 months old and as old as 85. So the shock, the trauma, is something that has not worn off. Israelis feel it. That's not the only reason, though. Every place you go to in Israel, you will see the pictures of the hostages. Every place. So you live October 7th because the hostages are still there. You live October 7th also because there's been no explanation for why not. You can understand, I can explain surprise. Intelligence surprises happen to everybody. They certainly happen to us. 9/11 was an intelligence surprise. We had all the information we needed, but we had a set of assumptions through which we read the information. Your assumptions create a prism through which you see reality. And so every bit of information you get, if every item you get is basically validated by your assumptions or it's dismissed by your assumptions. This is what happened in Israel. The assumption was the only real threat we faced was in the north or in the West Bank. Gaza, we don't have to worry. We built an underground barrier. They thought the real threats from Gaza were going to come through tunnels because that's where Israeli soldiers in the past had been kidnapped. And those tunnels were now blocked because there was an underground barrier. They felt they had whatever early warning they needed, they would get. And they were convinced, the Gazans understood they had nothing to be gained by trying to come into Israel. And it would cost them because Israel was now allowing 20,000 Gazans to work every day in Israel. Those Gazans who worked in Israel made 10 times what they could make in Gaza, assuming they had a job in Gaza, where unemployment is 50% or was 50%. So they thought, through a combination of factors, there couldn't be a surprise. So there was a shock. But then B, the unpreparedness of the Israeli military, the vaunted Israeli military, was also a shock. So what do you have? You have October 7th still because the hostages. You have October 7th still because there's been no real explanation for how this could have happened. And you have October 7th still because there's been no accountability. This is the worst day in Israel's history, and there's been no accountability. Not of the military who failed, not of the political leadership who failed. So it's still October 7th. Okay. So I understand there's a little hook here. So if I go on too long, I disappear. There's a trap door. I disappear. So let me wrap it up, and I'll turn it over to questions. I was going to say, someone who's a long-time negotiator, I have the capacity to go on for very long periods of time, not take a breath, not repeat myself. There were times when I was mediating where basically if I didn't do that, we would have food fights, but that's not the case here. So let me wrap it up this way. You hear talk about a two-state solution. Now you have an Israeli government today that rejects the idea of two states. You don't have anybody on the Palestinian side at this point who could deliver. Hamas, by the way, rejects two states. Throughout the time that I was a negotiator, every single time we were making progress, we got a Hamas bomb. You think we got the Hamas bombs because they wanted progress? No, the bombs came because they wanted to stop the progress. The October 7th was they saw normalization coming between Israel and Saudi Arabia. Hamas has no interest in an outcome where Israel exists, quite the opposite. So they're not for two states. The Israeli public today is not there. The Israeli public today is absolutely convinced if there's a Palestinian state, it'll be led by Hamas, and therefore it'll be a mortal threat. So where we are today is far from where we need to be. But I will say this, and I'll wrap it up this way. For those who say one state is the only logical outcome, They ignore that this conflict has been fed and created by a reality. There are two national movements competing for the same space. There is a Palestinian national identity that is connected to the land. There is a Jewish national identity that is connected to the land. It existed prior to the state of Israel because the Jews who lived in the diaspora prayed every year to return to Jerusalem. The reality of the people who live in Israel, they were born there. They are connected to the land just as Palestinians are connected to the land. They will not coexist in one state because in one state you don't fulfill your national identity. The idea that you can have one state that is entirely equal, Ahmed Ghanem, who is someone close to Marwan Barghouti, who is a Palestinian who is in Israeli jails, he once said in a public group that I actually invited him to, he said, in one state, either we, the Palestinians, will try to dominate the Israelis, or the Israelis will try to dominate us. So one state is a guarantee for perpetual conflict. Two states may look very hard to achieve right now, but it doesn't mean you give up on trying to produce it. And since I'm out of time, someone can ask me, how do we begin to produce it given how bad things look today? Okay, so I will stop there and I'll take your questions. And I also understand, since I've been using one of the mics, I think these mics you're supposed to come and, you can go to mics or actually not. I'll put this back and I'll go to the podium. Yeah, but if you want to come over here, you can do this one too.
Lose his coalition, he may be driven out of power.
So I want to explain, in effect, what the Biden administration has been trying to do. Since November, there has not been a hostage deal. You have at least, thank you, you have over 100 hostages who are still being held, although the expectation at this point is that probably more than half of them are no longer alive. So the idea, a framework was put together all the way back in February that created 3 phases. 42 days at a time, you'd have releases. In the second phase, there would be discussion of a permanent ceasefire. Right now, there is agreement on the framework. It actually, framework has 18 paragraphs, 14 are agreed. So that sounds pretty good, right? The problem is you have 4 that aren't. To put perspective on that, in negotiations where I have a lot of history, at the time of the START negotiations, Margaret Tutwiler was the spokesperson of the State Department, and as I was going into the negotiations, which were coming towards a conclusion, she said, "How many issues do you have left?" I said, 4. And we went for 6 hours. When I came out, she asked me, "How many issues do you have left?" I said, "We did really well." So she said, "Oh, so how many are left?" I said, 4. He said, "What do you mean?" I said, "We finished those 4, we have 4 new ones." When you're headed towards an agreement, the last issues that may not have seemed important become very important. Right now, in answer to your question, I don't know. The administration, I think, is going to come out with a bridging proposal, a more comprehensive bridging proposal. I don't know exactly when that'll be. Will that produce an agreement? I don't know. I don't know if Yahya Sinwar, the head of Hamas, I don't know if he has a real interest in doing a deal. And it's pretty clear that within Israel, there's a debate among Israelis over whether Prime Minister Netanyahu is prepared to do a deal. If Sinwar would say yes, I think it would be impossible for Netanyahu to say no, and that would kind of determine where we are likely to be. I'm not sure that's going to be the case. I do think the process that the administration has worked on was logical and even morally right. The problem is if you allow Yahya Sinwar to be the arbiter, I'm not sure you get there. It's worth trying. An alternative would be to basically go to Netanyahu and say, come up with a definition of success. At this point, Israel has dismantled Hamas as a military. They no longer exist as a military. At this point, they have dismantled at least half of the infrastructure. Hamas built 350 miles of tunnels, right? 350 miles of tunnels. I've spent a lot of time in Gaza. It's an impoverished place. Think about all the cement, the wiring, the metal, the piping that went into producing 350 miles of tunnels, which were not, by the way, available for Palestinians in Gaza to go into. Their aim was resistance against Israel, okay? So, you know, if Israel has dismantled the military and had dismantled more than half of the military infrastructure, which is not just tunnels, it's weapons labs, weapons depots, weapon production facilities, and if we can basically come up with an approach that demonstrates we will cut off the smuggling. Gaza was an open-air prison for the people who live there, but it was not an open-air prison for Hamas. They got whatever they needed. So if you can cut off the smuggling, given the level of destruction, then you can ensure that Hamas cannot reconstitute itself. You still need an alternative to Hamas to govern Gaza afterwards. I mentioned the UAE earlier. The UAE has a field hospital in Gaza today. It has 4 bakeries that feed 500,000 people every day. They have a relationship with Israel. They are prepared to come in. One of the things they require is a pathway to a Palestinian state for them to come in, because they don't want to go into Gaza and be stuck there forever. They want to know there's a political vision and a political pathway. So if the administration, if you can't get a hostage deal, then what about trying to get hostage releases by ending the war? Hamas has said, end the war, we release the hostages. Focus on ending the war by focusing on, okay, define success. I just gave you an outline of what success could look like. So there is something that can be done there, I believe. So.
Yeah, maybe 2 questions about Iran. One is retrospective. I know we can't think what if, but how do you see the exit from the JCPOA in terms of a turning point or one that didn't make any difference?
Yeah.
And prospective, you know, we see Iran becoming a player, at least with assets in places much farther than the near Middle East. And so do you think this is likely to become sort of a more global?
So all right, so look, the JCPOA was not perfect. The JCPOA was a nuclear deal with Iran. President Trump withdrew from it in 2017, but he didn't, when he withdrew from it, in 2018, the first year that he withdrew from it, he allowed Iran to continue to sell oil to 8 countries. 1 year later, he revoked those waivers. Iran, in the aftermath of that, did 2 things. One, they began to no longer respect the limits of the JCPOA. And 2, when the waivers were revoked, they began to create their own version of what Trump talked about, maximum pressure. They created their own maximum pressure. They attacked directly the most important oil processing facility in Saudi Arabia called Abqaiq. They attacked tankers, and basically they put a lot of pressure on America's friends in the region. Leaving the JCPOA, if you were going to leave the JCPOA as President Trump did, you needed to recognize this gave us leverage with the Europeans to get either a follow-on agreement to the JCPOA or to close some of the loopholes that were built into the JCPOA. They were prepared to pay quite a bit to keep us in the deal, but the president withdrew. What I'm suggesting to you is his threats to withdraw gave us leverage, and we should have used the leverage. If you're going to withdraw, then you ought to have a strategy for what you're going to do when you withdraw. We had no strategy for what to do when withdrew, and basically it legitimized Iran then going back to building its program. To be fair, the Iranians basically violated all the limits during the Trump administration, but they took a huge leap forward in the Biden administration. The next administration, whether it's Harris or it's Trump, needs to have a strategy towards Iran. Now, one point I'll add, which is related to your second question. I talked about the economic problems Iran has. They don't even come close to the real problems they have. Because of climate change, Iran doesn't have the water resources to maintain even 70% of their current population. When I cite that figure, it's not me. This is an Iranian water specialist in Iran saying they cannot sustain their population. So something pretty dramatic has to be done. I would like to see us. Diplomacy and statecraft is all about how you exercise leverage. And what does that mean? To get others to do what you would like based on persuasion, dissuasion, encouragement, or penalty. We could go to the Iranians and say, look, we can help you with your water problem. We're not going to help you with your water problem if you're a threat to everybody. There are ways to sort of get at this. I would also say the Supreme Leader is not a spring chicken. He's 85. He is considered not to be in great health, although when I first went into the government a long time ago, Khomeini was in his early 80s, not considered to be in great health. People thought he'd be gone soon, and I read when I got into the government about every malady he had, and he lived another 10 years. So he could be there a short time, or he could be there a long time. Why is it significant? Authoritarian regimes are most vulnerable during periods of succession because they create uncertainty, because competition in elites becomes acute, because there's a competition to see who can emerge. This is not, in the long term, a stable regime. It is very reminiscent of what the Soviet Union looked like in 1980. So there is a potential for change there. We should be smart about how we think ahead about that and think about how you take advantage of it. Yeah.
My name is Ann Ghazi, and just because I look like a Muslim, I want to just clarify a few things. I am a Muslim, but I'm not an Arab. I converted in university, so I just wanted to make that clear. So I have a paper just because I want to list out the wars that the U.S. has initiated or that they've funded in the Middle East just this century. Afghanistan, Iraq, Syria, Libya, Yemen, Pakistan, Somalia, Palestine, and Sudan. And I know that you had mentioned that these governments are failed states. A lot of these are not doing well. It could be as a direct result of that. And over 1 million people have been murdered. And that is based on statistics from Brown's University Cost of the War Project, Iraq Body Count Project, The Lancet, and Air Wars. Okay, so as it's been argued that war represents the failure of peaceful political solutions, which I think is probably what you've tried all your life to do, and obviously hasn't been very successful. Do you agree that the U.S. government's recurring inability to foster peaceful resolutions points to a broader systematic failure as the hegemon in the world? And I think we can look at the Gaza genocide right now. And I want to just say I'm wearing a keffiyeh this week along with the students to just mark our remembrance of the children who have died in Gaza, who won't be going back to school because there are no schools for them. And I'm sorry it makes me emotional, but I lived in the Middle East for 32 years, and the Arab people are special to me. I have children who are half Arab. I was in Tahrir Square during Arab Spring, and I know what the people were struggling for. And I feel that you, as an ambassador, as a statesman, along with the governments, have no idea about the lives of the people I lived in Saudi Arabia. I lived in Egypt for 32 years. I lived with the people, and I know how they feel. And nobody has forgotten these million plus people that have died at the hands of the U.S. military. So if you could just explain, if you remember my question after all that, do you agree that the U.S. government's recurring inability to foster peaceful resolution points to a broader systematic failure as a hegemon in the world?
First, let me say I respect your emotion because it's genuine, and there's a reality. You have a right to feel emotional about what we see, especially in Gaza. I think Israelis have a right to feel their shock and trauma too. One of the things, by the way, and I'll answer your question in a second, one of the things which I didn't mention that makes it so hard to make peace between Israelis and Palestinians right now is because there are mutual traumas. The Israelis, by the way, they don't see the images of what's going on in Gaza. They don't. Just not shown. It's not because they don't have a free press. No one's showing it. They don't see it. Part of it, I suspect, is they can't absorb anybody else's pain because of their own. The same is true of the Palestinians. Palestinians deny there were any atrocities that were committed on October 7th. They can't see the Israeli pain given the pain they feel. When you have mutual trauma, it takes time to get beyond it. So number one, as someone who, I can tell you, as someone who tried to negotiate on this and for a long time, I had Palestinians and I had Israelis both plead with me to succeed. At the end of the day, the U.S. can't impose a peace. Any peace that's imposed won't endure because whoever doesn't like it is going to defect from it when they can. Do we need different leaderships in both places? Yeah, we do. In terms of your latter question, I don't accept the fact that all these wars were driven by the United States. I don't accept the fact that the United States is responsible for all these conflicts. I don't accept it. I just don't agree with it. Have we made mistakes? Yes. Was the Iraq war a mistake? Yes. Yes. But if you look at who else is out there in the world, we see what the Russians did in Ukraine. We see China supporting what the Russians are doing in Ukraine. If the United States doesn't play a major role, there will be a vacuum and it will get filled, and it will not be filled by forces that are interested in peacemaking. It'll be filled by forces who have their own agendas. Iran's agenda for the Middle East is not a peaceful agenda. It's one designed to promote their power. We have to think better and come up with better strategies about how to play a role to reduce conflicts and resolve conflicts. Not all conflicts can be resolved, but they can certainly be mitigated. We need to have mitigating strategies to begin with, and after the mitigating strategies, we need to be able to go and try to resolve them. Sorry. So yes, look, I respect your views, but I don't share them.
90% of Iranian oil is purchased by China.
Correct.
The people in the streets, the people of Iran, do not broadly support that regime. What do you think about the possibility of regime change by basically putting tariffs on China until they stop buying oil from Iran, which would, cutting off their oil supply and their revenues, the people might basically revolt against the government?
I personally think it's a good idea. I think it's important. I think there's a value in terms of raising the cost to the Iranians of what they're doing on the outside. The sanctions, there hasn't been the kind of sanctions enforcement related to the oil sales, at least what is being bought by the Chinese. I think we should do more in that regard. I said a little earlier that I do think the potential for change in Iran is real. When I hear the words regime change, I kind of recoil. We're really bad at regime change. If it comes from within, it's one thing. If it comes from without, it's almost always guaranteed to fail and at a very high price. But you're not calling for that. You're talking about squeezing the Iranian regime unless they change their behaviors. And one way to squeeze the regime is, in fact, making it harder and harder for them to sell their oil. I will say, just again, on a factual basis, the Trump administration did squeeze them, and they lost a lot of revenue for sure. I sometimes hear claims that it prevented Iran from supporting Hezbollah and Hamas. Not true. The monies that Hezbollah was getting were around $1 billion a year. When Iran was squeezed during the Trump administration, those went down to about $500 million a year. And even during that time, Hamas still got their basic annual stipend from the Iranians. Now, what that highlights is that pursuing that strategy on the Iranian part is obviously important to them, to the point where they were sacrificing on the inside, and it was producing greater alienation on the inside. So there is something to what you say, but one of the things about these kinds of regimes, they're pretty good at imposing austerity on their publics, pretty bad at imposing austerity on themselves. You shouldn't have any illusions that just because we would do that, we'd suddenly see a collapse of the regime. We would not. The regime will double down. It will increase the level of coercion. We're coming up in 4 days on the killing, the second anniversary of the killing of Mahsa Amini, the young 21-year-old Kurdish woman who was basically beaten to death because she was wearing a hijab, but she wasn't wearing it appropriately. My guess is the Iranians will be doing all sorts of preemptive arrests over the next couple of days to try to prevent demonstrations remembering her. But that says there are vulnerabilities there, but don't have any illusions about the regime will use coercion. Its most important objective and priority is regime survival.
Hello, my name is Adam Sarr. I'm an undergraduate student here at Case Western, and I'd be very curious to hear more about your experiences as being a lead negotiator in the Israel-Palestine peace process in the 90s, and what lessons those may hold for peace processes moving forward when trying to shape the day after, hopefully that we get there soon after this war. Thank you.
It's a kind of truism that you learn more from your failures than your successes. So yeah, there's a lot of lessons that I've learned. I would say they're on both sides, including what we do, but also on both the Israeli side and the Palestinian side. On our part, we made a mistake by not focusing enough on ground up. Peacemaking comes from top down, but also ground up. If it's only top down, the substance of life getting better and of creating connections between peoples isn't there. That's actually the stuff of peace. All the formulas, those are formulas, they're all words. Unless they're reinforced and validated by life experience. Unless people see that life changes. Unless they see each other through a different lens, then it's a failing. We actually had an annex in the interim agreement in 1995 that was people to people. And I didn't put enough emphasis on that. I should have put much more on that. A second failing, we had a Palestinian prime minister named Salam Fayyad, who was a reformer, and who basically said, we're not going to build a Palestinian state based on symbols. We're going to build it based on substance, a variation of what I was just saying. We're going to build it from the ground up. We should have done much more, both to help him directly, but we should have done much more with the Israelis to make sure that they didn't get in his way, did things that made it easier for him to show his way worked. We shouldn't have with the Israelis. One of the big mistakes was their whole approach to settlement activity. It made Palestinians feel powerless. Now, if you're in a negotiation, you make one side feel powerless, you give them an incentive to demonstrate they're not. We should have done much more to prevent that. We didn't. Now, somewhat to be fair, Rabin, when he was the prime minister, gets assassinated because of what he's doing. And so it was, when we were hearing, look, there's a threshold, there's a political threshold that we can meet and we can't do more. We had to find a better way to balance that than we did. On the Palestinian side, we were not good at holding them responsible on areas where they should have been responsible. I would like to see, for example, even now, I would like to see the Biden administration and whomever comes in next say the Palestinians are a people. As a people, they have a right to self-determination. But they can only act on that right. They don't get to fulfill that right until they also fulfill their responsibilities. So that means they assume a set of obligations. You can't have a state if you have independent militias. You can't have a state that's based on the narrative of resistance, not coexistence. You can't have a state that is prepared to align with Iran. You can't have a state where Hamas can emerge and be the leader of it, because Hamas will never end its conflict with Israel. So if we're asking that of the Palestinians, then we have to ask things of the Israelis. The Israelis cannot be acting on the ground in a way that makes a Palestinian state impossible. There cannot be settler violence that goes unpunished. Palestinians have to feel that they have security and they're not vulnerable. So there needs to be, the main lesson I'm describing to you is, there needs to be a parallelism of responsibilities on both sides. And one last thing, we need to create a virtuous cycle. Each side, even when they would do things that were good for the other wouldn't acknowledge it. The reluctance to acknowledge it meant, gee, we can't look like we're giving them credit for something. A, because that'll put more pressure on us to do something, but B, before those who are critical of this, there'll be a backlash. Both sides have got to understand that when you create a virtuous cycle, each side feeds each other in more positive behaviors. We had one amazing atmosphere in the negotiating room. Israelis and Palestinians, if people saw the way they got along as negotiators, you would have thought we'd have peace a long time ago. They got along at a personal level in an extraordinary way. Their senses of humor were the same. Oftentimes I would say one of the things I learned even then was maybe I could drive them to both reject what I was saying so it would drive them together. The fact is there are a lot of lessons to be learned, but those are that's kind of a thumbnail sketch. Okay, I answered every question. You have no more. Now you know the conflict in the region. It's great.
Any final thoughts in our last minute?
Look, yes, in the last minute I'll say this. As grim as it looks, don't give up. This is not something that one gives up on. The people often ask me, why do you remain committed to this? And my answer is because these are two peoples that deserve something better. And I know it at the level not of the politicians, but at the level of the publics that I used to see all the time. I had Israeli mothers with tears in their eyes ask me to succeed. I had Palestinian mothers with tears in their eyes ask me to succeed. We owe it to them.